December 24th, Sukuna is having a nice nap, and there's a knock at the door. But Sukuna is so deep in sleep, Mahoraga opens the door for him. What? It's the fraud inspector, Russ's gambler. What's he doing here? He's come to examine whether or not Sukuna is actually a fraud. What's up guys, Russ's Gambler here, and in today's video, I want to go ahead and talk about Sukuna the Slumped One, since him and his potential fraudulence has been a topic of discussion for weeks now. This is my first JJK video in a long time, and if you enjoyed this content, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It's a win-win for both of us. Before we actually get into whether or not Sukuna is a fraud, let's first be clear on what a fraud actually is. From my own understanding of it and how I use it personally, it means someone who is portrayed in a certain light, usually at high status, by the community or the series, but turns out to not live up to said portrayal. I'll give you guys some examples from other series. Do you guys remember watching Hunter x Hunter and the Shadow Beast pulled up to kill Uvagin? I kid you not, the entire time that they were on screen, the characters in the show were hyping them up so much, saying that Uvagin has no chance. Then literally the next second, they got soloed by him. That's a group full of frauds. Or another example, which is very literal, King from One Punch Man. Everyone in the show, from what I know, thinks he's this untouchable man and very strong, but he's the complete opposite of said portrayal. That's a fraud in plain sight. However, I will say this is a different circumstance, as the author wasn't trying to show us that he's strong, rather he made it clear that King wasn't all that. And finally, my favorite example of what a fraud is Katakuri from One Piece. He's hyped up by the show and the community as one of the strongest in the series, but little do people realize that bro's been power clipped to oblivion. Now, the likes of the Monster Trio would be able to violate him any day of the week. That's what a fraud is. Someone portrayed in a certain way, but them themselves are just not up to those expectations. What will qualify a certain person to be a fraud is a strong difference in portrayal versus reality. So now with this definition in mind, let's find out whether or not Sukuna is in fact a fraud. Like I said, he's been the topic of discussion for literally over a month for being a fraud, and so let's get into the reasons he's being called such. Since chapter 223, we have been witnessing the most anticipated fight in the entire series. Sukuna, the strongest sorcerer in history, versus the strongest sorcerer of today, Gojo Satoru. The fight kicked off with a 200% hollow purple, and Sukuna was able to deal with it pretty easily. After the surprise attack, they go on to start their battle properly, and they go neck and neck for chapters on end. 2 chapters in, and they already started using their trump cards, throwing out domain expansions. This is where almost everyone thought Gojo was fucked. Since Sukuna's domain expansion has no barrier, his sure hit effect ended up destroying the outside of Gojo's domain expansion, which we knew is already weak to attacks. And so for the first time in the entire series, we see Gojo get hurt by someone after his awakening against Toji. But this isn't like some regular hit or slash, it was continuous, leading to Gojo having to not only spam reverse curse technique, but spam simple domains and also try to get out of the area of effect of the sure hit from Sukuna's domain expansion. But even through all this, Gojo kept a level head, even used a reverse curse technique to replenish his burnt out infinity, and eventually hit Sukuna with the reversal red. At this point, there's nothing to complain about regarding Sukuna. They're actually neck and neck, no one doing better than the other. Next chapter, they go for another domain clash, and once again, Sukuna destroys Gojo's domain, and that still doesn't stop Gojo, as for the 3rd time, they go ahead and clash domains. This time, however, to a logic-breaking extent, as the barrier rules were changed massively to the point where they were enclosed in a minuscule barrier. And this time, however, both of their domains crash and burn. But in this chapter, we find out what Gojo is actually thinking while fighting the first guy to go toe-to-toe with him in a decade. He asked himself, why didn't Sukuna even try to use the 10 Shadows technique or Mahoraga inside the domain? He asked this because the entire time, Sukuna has only been using the curse technique that his domain granted him, Cleave and Dismantle, nothing else. But then we see the wheel that accompanies Mahoraga click, and we see Gojo get a nosebleed. This was the start of the Sukuna fraud allegations. As soon as this chapter came out, the topic of discussion was if Sukuna has been using Mahoraga the entire time to adapt to Affinity, and he was already being clowned. But let's continue on. They go in for the 4th domain clash, and again, both of their domains break at the same time, but this time some of Sukuna's face is burned off. Gojo then punches Sukuna into a wall, then expands domain expansion. Because of said punch, Gojo was able to release his domain expansion literally an instant faster than Sukuna, and so he is affected with the sure hit of Unlimited Void. Now Sukuna is stood still with infinite information flowing into his brain, and Gojo punches him in the chest. But Gojo isn't done yet. He wants to destroy his lungs and liver so that he can't just revive himself like he did at the beginning of the series with no heart. But before Gojo can get to Sukuna, Maharaga appears from the shadows and breaks Unlimited Void. This is where the memes came in. Because now that Gojo had a chance to literally kill Sukuna, the 10 Shadows technique was used to save his ass. The actual argument for him being a fraud is the fact that if Gojo went against Sukuna in the Heian era, Sukuna wouldn't have the 10 Shadows and therefore Gojo would have just decimated the nigga. Before I input my own thoughts, I think we should continue the analysis of the fight so far. It's revealed that the reason Maharaga was able to adapt to a limited void inside the domain was because Sukuna used Megami as a pawn to experience it. This is yet another thing people used to prove that Sukuna was a fraud. But let's continue. Gojo taunts him saying that he's fighting desperately, but Sukuna retaliates talking about Gojo's broken hacks. Gojo goes ahead to try and let out a 5th domain expansion, but this time he can't and his nose starts bleeding intensely. Apparently, the use of cursed energy to damage his brain and the use of reverse curse technique to heal his burnt out curse technique strains him intensely. Sukuna taunts him, then tries to let off his 5th domain expansion, but it malfunctions as well. Even though Sukuna had used Megami as a tool to adapt a limited void, the sure hit still impacted Sukuna to the point where he couldn't expand his domain expansion. So at this point, they'll be throwing hands without using their trump cards. In the next 2 chapters, it's all about Sukuna trying to adapt to infinity, because if he does, it's likely the entire fight will be turned on his head. So Gojo goes crazy, throwing hands and avoiding using reversal red in order to make him convinced that he'll only use blue. Sukuna's wheel spins 2 more times before Gojo goes in for the final finisher. So here's what he does. He lets off a reversal red, shifts around Sukuna to where Sukuna is facing the opposite way. The reversal red explodes from behind Sukuna, pushing him towards Gojo, and he performs the strongest Black Flash in the entire series. This Black Flash, coupled with the critical hit everyone was blabbing about last chapter, literally knocks Sukuna out cold. No, like deadass. He literally starts sleeping standing up. But before everyone can even think that Gojo has won, Maharaga appears from the shadows again and the wheel spins once more. Now, Maharaga has adapted to infinity and the fight might take a turn for the worse. My opinions on the future of the fight isn't relevant here. What is whether or not Sukuna is actually a fraud. Let's once again go over the arguments for Sukuna being a fraud. 1. Sukuna is relying on the 10 Shadows technique in order to beat Gojo. 2. Sukuna's past self would have got killed by Gojo. And 3. Sukuna is using Megami as a tool to fight against Gojo. This all stems from the community thinking of Sukuna versus Gojo as being a fair fight, but little do some people realize this was never a fair fight to begin with. First of all, there are 2 ways you can go if you want to say Sukuna isn't a fraud. One of them my boy Blaziken talked about in his chapter review of chapter 228, and the other one is something you can say regarding Sukuna's actual portrayal in the story. So let's start with the first one. The first argument against Sukuna being a fraud is the fact that the 10 Shadows technique shouldn't be taken away from Sukuna's potential win. The reason this is said is because he's the one who learned how to turn himself into a cursed object, and so his use of it led to him stealing the 10 Shadows. Taking that away from him would have to be reciprocated with Kenjaku, since his entire thing is switching bodies and collecting cursed techniques. This argument actually makes sense, and big up to Blaziken for saying this, because I'll be real, I don't think I would have ever thought of that. It is true that him taking the 10 Shadows isn't something that should be taken away from his win, because he didn't just get handed the technique for fighting Gojo. Sukuna planned this shit out the moment he saw Megami. He went out of his way to learn how to turn himself into a cursed object, and through his masterful planning and manipulation, he got the technique. So honestly, it is fair play. However, there is a little bit of play on the fact that there is no honor in a win like that, because that's not the curse technique he was granted at birth and things of that nature. I definitely feel like this is the case, but then again, like I just said, it's not like he was just handed the technique. He wanted it and he manipulated the entire series in order to get it. So is it really all that bad? But on top of that, regarding honor, there's the fact that Sukuna might not actually give a f about that shit. What is honor to a guy who literally doesn't care about anyone other than himself? When Sukuna got roasted by Gojo for taking orders from Kenjaku, Sukuna literally just tunes out of the conversation. He literally does not care about what others think about him. He just enjoys the thrill of battle. So what he does to win is to win, not to have honor. And that's why Sukuna just might not be a fraud. Sukuna is of course portrayed as one of the strongest in the entire series, but then again, he's portrayed as someone who will do anything to win because he only cares about himself, no one else. Like Uro said, he's a calamity. Him using other people, like Megumi, or other people's curse techniques, like Megumi again, in battle doesn't interfere with his portrayal because that's what he's always been portrayed as. So no, I don't think Sukuna is a fraud. In fact, in his current form, he's probably the strongest in the show as he's officially manipulated circumstances to make Maharaga adapt to infinity. Now regarding the Hayanera battle, he does have 2 extra arms. So in this fight, while I think it still would be a close fight, the one who would come out on top is Hikari.